A few weeks ago, I made a video on who is the Kevin Durant of football, and I had 3 candidates. Before I spoil them for you, make sure you go watch that video, but the candidates were João Moutinho, Sol Campbell, but we eventually narrowed it down to Harry Kane. And that video did well with a lot of comments naming players like Neymar, Zlatan, Figo and Henry, but it did get me thinking, what other comparisons could we make? And I've got a few players in mind that I could turn this into a series eventually, but today we're going to talk about my favourite NBA player of all time, and Derrick Rose, and who his natural comparison in football is. So much like last video, I'll give you 3 candidates, with one being the most closest comparison in my opinion. But let's take a look at some of the criteria we have. So first of all, Derrick Rose had an incredible peak. Rookie of the Year, youngest MVP in league history at 22, multiple All-Star appearances, and carried the Chicago Bulls until the weight of that took its toll on Derrick Rose. He tore his ACL in the 2012 playoffs. The 13-14 season, he missed the entire season with an injury after he got surgery on his left knee, and truly he was never the same after those 2 injuries. In his nearly 15-year NBA career, he had over 20 injuries, mostly to do with knees such as meniscus tears and sprains, and he lost a lot of his athletic ability due to that. And after the Chicago Bulls eventually gave up on him, he became somewhat of a journeyman towards the end of his career, going to the Knicks, the Cavaliers, the Timberwolves, the Pistons and the Grizzlies. So this footballer has to have a peak of one of the best in the league or in the world, have a peak at a young age as well, but have an injury altering their career and leaving people thinking, what if? And for bonus points, have a cult hero status, a borderline legend with their club or with just football fans in general, something that Derrick Rose had at Chicago. So let's answer the question, who is football's Derrick Rose?
Now you can see Antoine Griezmann.
I love Derrick Rose.
First up, some of you may already thought of this player straight off the bat, and we're going to go to Jack Wilshere. Much like Derrick Rose, Jack Wilshere at 18 and 19 looked like England's next generational midfielder, just like Rose looked like the next generational superstar in the NBA. And Wilshere's best game is undoubtedly his Champions League performance against the prime Barcelona in February 2011, where the then 19-year-old Englishman went head-to-head with legends like Xavi, Iniesta and Busquets, but it was the Englishman who looked like the veteran in the middle of the park. He finished with a pass completion rate of 93% as Arsenal won 2-1 and he actually earned man of the match honours. But unfortunately, much like Derrick Rose, Wilshere's career was derailed by injury. The season after that performance, in the pre-season anyway, against the New York Red Bulls, he hobbled off with an ankle injury, which didn't really seem that serious at first, but over the course of the 11-12 season, he missed 416 days due to injury, as it actually turned out to be a fractured ankle, and he'd miss 102 games according to Transfer Market. And it would actually be that ankle injury that would cause the fall of Wilshere's career, missing over 200 games at Arsenal since 2009 to 2016, before ending up at Bournemouth, West Ham and Aarhus in Denmark before retiring at age just 29. But it fully doesn't match Derrick Rose, just because Rose's level, the peak level anyway, was one of the best players in the world. Where as good as Wilshere was, and he was very good, he was never at the peak of one of the best midfielders in England or the world. And you could argue that Wilshere maybe doesn't have that cult hero status that Rose has at Chicago, despite being a popular figure at Arsenal. So I would say this one is pretty close, but not nailed on. But Jack Wilshere still does have some comparisons to Derrick Rose. In at number 2, and this one is a little left field, I'm going to go with Eden Hazard. So here's why this comparison works. Both were undisputed elite players at their peak. Hazard was a top 5 to 7 player in the world at Chelsea, and arguably the Premier League's best individual talent for several seasons. For Derrick Rose, of course, the youngest MVP ever, truly one of NBA's top players during the early 2010s, and that matches better than Wilshere's peak already. And of course, both players hit an abrupt decline due to injuries. Derrick Rose's ACL tear changed the trajectory of his entire career, and Hazard's time at Real Madrid was wrecked by persistent injuries, ending his elite window almost overnight. Both are remembered as superstars whose prime felt incomplete, but Hazard's peak was definitely longer than Rose's, but both felt like they had another level that they really didn't get to show. But unfortunately with this one as well, it is not a 1-to-1 match. As mentioned, Hazard's peak lasted longer. He had 5 to 6 elite seasons at Chelsea, and even before that at Lille. Rose pretty much only had 2 to 3 years at the top before his ACL tore everything apart. Also, Hazard wasn't derailed in his early 20s. Rose's injury came at 22, during his ascent to the top of the game. Hazard's decline came closer towards the end of his career at ages 29 and 30. And unlike Derrick Rose, Hazard still achieved big team trophies. Premier Leagues, Europa Leagues, and of course a legendary 2018 World Cup run with Belgium, where you could argue Eden Hazard has already left a legacy as one of the best players that we've ever seen in this generation at least. Whereas Rose, you could argue, did have a great peak and is still one of the greats, but we never really got to see it on the scale and the length that Hazard was able to at Chelsea. So looking at it this way, Hazard sort of equals the superstar who fell off too soon due to injuries, whereas Derrick Rose sort of had the career stopped before he could blossom sort of story. It's a strong defensible comparison, but unfortunately it's not perfect. But in my opinion, this one is a bit more closer than Wilshere because Hazard actually reached a global best level just like Rose, but you can argue Hazard still has a legacy of being one of the best ever in terms of being in the Premier League, just because his window was so long at Chelsea in his peak seasons. There was a few seasons in between where maybe he wasn't at the best, but I think in terms of Derrick Rose only having those sort of 3 seasons, whereas Eden Hazard had 5 or 6, the comparison is not there fully. But in my opinion, the closest comparison to Derrick Rose in football terms is R9 Ronaldo Nazario. Ronaldo Nazario is absolutely the closest football equivalent to Derrick Rose by a mile. He's one that fits every major pillar of the Derrick Rose arc, not just 1 or 2. Both were generational talents, who at one point were the best in the world at their respective fields. Rose, the youngest MVP ever, at his peak he was arguably the most unstoppable guard in the NBA. R9, FIFA World Player of the Year at 20, Ballon d'Or winner twice, widely considered the most explosive striker ever. These weren't just top players, these were the players. And that's sort of the Derrick Rose energy, a player whose talent felt somewhat alien. But unfortunately for both their stories, their peaks did not last long. R9's true peak was short. 1996 to 1999, untouchable, maybe the best individual peak in football history. But then the knee injuries hit brutally. Same for Derrick Rose. 2009 to 2012, a meteoric rise, Rookie of the Year, MVP, and at one point, maybe one of the faces of the league. And then, the ACL tear ends the ascent instantly. Both peaks were so bright they left shockwaves, even though both were brief, but both suffered catastrophic injuries that reshaped the rest of their careers. Not just normal injuries, but career-defining ones. With R9 suffering 2 patella tendon ruptures, basically unheard of for a top striker, and of course with Derrick Rose the ACL tear and the repeated knee issues. Both went from an untouchable super athlete to what could have been overnight. And both reinvented their careers at lower levels / smaller clubs. And this is a massive point I alluded to in the intro with Rose being a journeyman. Rose ended up on teams like the Cavs, the Knicks, the Wolves. He was a respected veteran, but never the MVP phenom that he was back in 2012. But he still did perform to a good level, including a 50-point game for the Timberwolves in 2019, and you could argue it was the same with R9. Post-injuries ended up at Corinthians and AC Milan, still gigantic clubs, and the vibe was similar. Flashes of brilliance, a cult hero return, but clearly not the unstoppable prime version as he was in his early years. And again, it's that same Second Life nostalgia fans feel. Both sort of became what if legends. Ask any basketball or football fan, who is the greatest player of all time that was derailed by injuries? The answers are, mostly, Derrick Rose and Ronaldo Nazario. They are the archetypes of what if footballers. And for me, maybe you could argue again, R9's peak was better than Derrick Rose and he still managed to win World Cups, club trophies, but in terms of individual stats, for me, it has to be this comparison as the closest sort of 1-to-1. Hazard and Wilshere both differ in a degree, but for me, R9 matches Rose in type. You look at Hazard, he peaked longer. Wilshere never hit the highest level of football. But R9, like Derrick Rose, was the best in the world. And both were very explosive players, an explosive striker and an explosive point guard. Both physical gifts were stripped away suddenly due to injuries. And Derrick Rose is the basketball version of that exact narrative with Ronaldo Nazario. Yes, that is the end of this video. Let me know what you thought. Do you think R9 is the best comparison? Am I missing someone? Is Hazard a better comparison? Is Wilshere a better comparison? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, what other sort of NBA players would you like to see? In my head, I've got a few. I've got someone like a Nikola Jokic or Wembanyama. Go even further back, you know, maybe someone like a Dennis Rodman would be interesting to explore. But who knows? Anyway, I've been Sam Mosega. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time, and peace.